you again
Thank
after
you.
these long days in the IIMF corridors. So, good morning from New York, and it's a pleasure to be here. Protocol observed, allow me to start my very short remarks. It is clear for everybody how COVID-19 pandemic is highlighting the importance of technology in addressing the disruptions. In order to move from a general debate to policy implementation, we need to start narrowing the subjects of our conversations in order to draw very pragmatic roadmaps. So following this narrow conversation approach, I will take the opportunity of the subjects of our plenary and address intellectual property rights as barriers from a technology transfer standpoint, and intellectual property rights as a strategic tool from a local innovation ecosystem standpoint. Because I strongly believe that intellectual property rights are an unavoidable issue when addressing the transition from natural resource intensive economies to knowledge-based economies. It's a small issue, but it's a crucial one. And in the case of Africa, I believe that we need to adopt a twofold approach. First, intellectual property rights, again, from a technology transfer standpoint, and this is crucial. This is a crucial issue in 2021, when Africa will start moving from importing vaccines to producing vaccines, where international intellectual property rights might become African intellectual property barriers. The second side of this twofold approach is, as I mentioned, intellectual property rights in terms of building national and regional IPR systems and treat IPRs as a valuable commodity, crucial to create and consolidate regional value chains and move along the global value chains. So in other words, the role of intellectual property rights in promoting ecosystems of innovation to boost the competitiveness of African business and moving up the global value chains. Let me start from the first side of this coin, addressing intellectual property rights as intellectual property barriers. And as I mentioned, today's best examples are COVID-19 vaccines. As you know, South Africa and India, which manufacture drugs and vaccines, last year, they made a proposal to the World Trade Organization, saying that, in a very strong and clear way, that intellectual property rules were hindering the urgent scale-up of vaccine production and provision of medical products. Right after that position, they face also a stronger position from some developed countries, nations, confirming that indeed intellectual property rights are a valuable commodity. And Africa, even from a pharmaceutical standpoint, is the last frontier. The director of the Africa CDC, Dr. John, in a news conference, he was very clear on this issue. And he gave two examples where the developing world had suffered from restricted access to medicines. The first example that he mentioned was the swine flu pandemic in the late 2000s. And second example was the HIV in the 90s. COVID-19 would not be the first one. According to him, and allow me to quote this example from Dr. John, in 96, HIV drugs were available. And we saw our mortality in developed world decreased drastically. But it would take 10 years before those drugs were accessible in Africa in a meaningful way. So in between, 12 million Africans die. So African Union, as everybody knows, is backing calls for drug makers to waive some intellectual property rights on COVID-19 medicines and vaccines, so we can speed up their rollout in Africa. Africa, down the road, of course, will need to move from import to production. And allow me to wrap up this first side of the coin, this twofold approach. First, where not challenged, improperly granted exclusive rights may cause considerable obstacles for follow-on innovation, especially in countries where local industries lack incentive capacity, which is the case of Africa. Second, broad exclusive rights, often held by foreign companies, block access by local producers to informal means of technology transfer through reverse engineering. Third, learning and follow-on innovation by domestic manufacturers in African countries also depend on the public domain available data. So data should be considered a public domain, information, materials, and research tools. Denying access to data, information, materials, and research tools overlay broad exclusive rights may hinder or prevent the development of local expertise, so limiting the potential for effective collaboration between foreign investors and local industries. Now I move to the second side of the coin, regarding intellectual property rights as crucial tools to build well-balanced and structured local IPR systems. In 2017, a survey in South Africa found that out of 200 technology startups, 43% have their own products, which means their own IP, their own intellectual property. So it is clear that IP is a valuable commodity, very well leveraged by developed countries, but not yet from African countries. So despite the fact that most of the countries in Africa, most of them, have IP legal frameworks and regulatory bodies, some African countries are even well placed in US Chamber International Index, such as Kenya and South Africa. So despite this fact, we in Africa, we have not been enabled to command IPRs as a valuable commodity. So according to available literature, there are essentially two main problems. First, the current local systems, again, the current IPR local systems, they are not well structured, and they are inaccessible, time-consuming, and costly. This is a good example. Allow me to tell you, Jean-Paul, this is a good example a shoot in our foot, if you allow me. Let me give you some examples from a costing standpoint. Kenya's patent registration fees are 13 times its GDP per capita. 13 times its GDP per capita. In Malaysia, this same figure is a good example, reality, with as
and this is the principle. And